Initially, it had not occurred to us to look at females only within our samples. The samples themselves are pretty small. They're not matched for subgroup analyses. Nevertheless, we know it's a huge area of importance looking at females because they have different brain organization. They incur different types of trauma, and when the trauma occurs, the physiological, hormonal, and emotional, social, and cultural changes or differences impact how the brain reorganizes. We're sure of it, but now we have to scientifically understand it a little better.
All right. So can you give us what the 2 or 3 big takeaways would have been from your presentation?
Sure. I think resting state fMRI.
Just say
sure.
The key points were.
Sure. The key points from my work with Dr. Maheen Adamson was that fMRI and resting state fMRI in particular is a really important, interesting biomarker to look at both TBI from the perspective of what occurs in the brain after a traumatic brain injury on a large scale, not just a single brain region or the volume of the brain, which is a very coarse measurement of its functional capacity, but looking at the connectivity across a broad swath of cortex, or the limbic cortex in particular, to understand how does that brain network reorganize and what can that tell us about what behaviors or deficits that person or that group of people might have down the line. So using resting state as a biomarker we think is at least one pretty cool and high potential candidate. And you could use it not only to prognosticate what types of behavioral abnormalities might these people have, but also looking at targeting treatments towards specific networks with, for example, non-invasive brain stimulation, or even following treatment response by looking at how network connectivity might reorganize back towards normalization. So that's one thing, is just using resting state as a biomarker. I think it's got potential. And then another takeaway is the limbic cortex, or limbic circuits. I specifically study the amygdala, which I think is a critical region in traumatic brain injury because it becomes injured, possibly particularly vulnerable because it's all the way in the anterior temporal cortex that, number one, rubs against the bottom of the skull when the brain is hit or the skull is hit, and then also it sits far out from the fulcrum, which is the neck, and so it experiences a lot of the torsional forces. And that goes with the orbital frontal cortex as well. And so I look at a lot of the brain circuits that emanate from the amygdala, connect the temporal lobe to the orbital frontal, as well as a lot of the other prefrontal structures. And so thinking about the limbic cortex as a critical, maybe vulnerable area of the brain, I think is another interesting takeaway, another good place to focus on.
I keep imagining shaking a lizard and seeing how it responds.
Right.
Lizard brain. Can you tell us what it means to you to be part of a Pink Concussion Conference?
Sure. So to be part of a Pink Concussion Conference, I think is exciting. It's a novel area. It's untouched. Like I had mentioned in the talk, women experience things different from a brain network organization perspective, and we only are barely scratching the surface of that in men and women together, but to look at a subgroup and really focus on nuanced difference allows us potentially to come up with targets for treatment and treatments that work for them, because coming up with treatments broadly and targeting men and women broadly hasn't worked for us so far. There's so many complicating factors just studying the normal men, the male and female brain, so looking at the abnormal male and female brain, looking at subgroups is important.
Right.
We just learned actually from Dr. Shah's talk that there's differences in the volume of certain structures, like the amygdala, for example, is bigger in men when controlling for total intracranial volume. And perhaps she mentioned that that's because there's more androgen receptors in the amygdala, whereas the hippocampus is bigger in females, and perhaps that's because it has more estrogen receptors. So just thinking about things like that and how the amygdala might be wired slightly different in women than men. I found in my other studies that there is differences in men and women, how the amygdala's volume itself is correlated with social network size, and the correlation strength and how that works is definitely different in men and women. One more thing just to say about pink concussion is that there's a passion behind it, and I think doing all this work is interesting scientifically, but without the link to the people that are suffering and this focus group and knowing the people behind motivating this passion and creating the momentum, it makes it much more real and much more interesting to do the research.